So as much as I enjoy machining, parting off is probably one of the bits that I enjoy the least. I mean, it is probably up there with having to change the chuck on this lathe. Both of them are absolutely horrifying. And it's a no small part because I've probably broken more inserts doing this than in any other type of cut that I do on the lathe. And when it goes wrong, it tends to go really wrong. You know, on a good day, it might be just a broken insert, which I can easily replace. But on a bad day, it'll break the tool holder and mess up the part. Now obviously it doesn't help that I have a smaller lathe, because doing this is probably one of the most demanding operations that I can do on a lathe, and this lathe just isn't as rigid as some of the bigger lathes that I've used. Now I do think I fixed the main source of weakness, which is the top slide, which has been replaced with a solid riser block. But before I go ahead and buy another parting blade holder, and yes, this one here is completely buggered and a replacement is going to be on the low end $50, I want to try another thing that will hopefully save my next tool holder from breaking. And that's going to be to try a rear mounted parting blade holder, which I'll mount roughly where that lead block is mounted. Now on face value it might sound a little bit crazy, but my Sherline lathe runs one of those and it can do some really amazing parting, especially considering just how small that lathe is. Now the logic behind it simply boils down to, in a normal cutting configuration, if the tool grabs the workpiece instead of cutting, it's going to get pulled downwards and into the workpiece, which is normally when the blade snaps. But if you mount it at the back, or if you mount it upside down, when the tool grabs, instead of being pulled into the workpiece, it should get pushed out of the work. It may not protect the tool every time, but it should reduce the risk. The only real downsides I can see is that in this configuration, it's not going to be as rigid, because it will be pulling the cross slide upwards, and the cross slide is going to be a lot more rigid with it being pushed down, in compression. The other downside is it will limit how big of a piece I can turn on this lathe, but after having a look, it'll limit me to about 75mm or about 3 inches, and very rarely do I turn anything that large. So for 99% of work that I do, I should be okay. Now I could also mount it normally in the tool post, but mount it upside down, although it would need some sort of tool holder to bring the tool cutting height up to the correct level. But instead I'm going to mount it on the back, mostly because I want it to be permanently installed so I can use it whenever I need to. Plus this is also one of the main reasons why I did the cross slide in the way that I did it in the first place, so I'm really excited to see how it works. With that said though, my plan may have overlooked one thing, which is the location of the T-slots. They're a little bit too close to the sides. So effectively what that means is, once I add the rear parting tool post, there's going to be no space for the stud. So unfortunately, what was going to be a very quick afternoon project to see if this actually worked, got a little bit more complicated than I hoped it would. So the first thing I'll have to do is make a riser block. This isn't really for adding height, it's more so for bringing the T-slots inboard. I have a piece of steel bar which is hopefully the right size. And by right size I mean I'm making this up as I go along, so we'll get this to work. So first I'll get it cut down and then I'll clean it up. So if you remember back when I made the other riser block, I machined in a key on the other side, which locks into the T-slot. And its main job is just to keep the riser block square to the tool post. And in the short time that I've been using it, it's turned out to be a really big success. So I'm going to do the exact same thing here. Just feeling the way that this end mill's cutting, I'm pretty sure it's on its last legs. It's cutting, but it's producing a lot more heat than you'd expect it to. I'll push on, but this will probably be its last project. This is the industry standard finger test. Surface finish is okay, but that end mill needs to be replaced. So with the fit about 99% of the way there, I'll take it to the vise and relieve the inside edges using a hacksaw, and then I'll use a file to make the fit perfect. And that's about as perfect as I could expect that fit to be. With that now done, I'll now drill and counterbore some holes so I can bolt this thing down. So with that now done, I wish I could say, let's test it out, but as it happens, I have no idea where all my spare T-nuts have gone. I'm pretty sure I made at least 5 or 6 spare ones. They're probably hanging out with all the dropped screws and dropped nuts that I can never find. So I guess give me a minute, I need to quickly make some more. Alright, and that bolts down pretty securely. Or at least I hope so. I bought a packet of 4 screws, and there were 4 screws, but in the 5 seconds that it took me to turn the camera on, I managed to lose it. So the next thing that I need to do is add the T-slots to the riser block, and whilst I do that, I'll also hunt around for the elusive missing screw. So I'm going to add 2 slots. One of them is going to be for holding the tool post, and one of them is going to be for holding, well, pretty much anything else. I've said it before, but having T-slots on a lathe is so incredibly helpful, and once you have them, you probably won't want to go back. With the riser block now done, we can now start to make the tool post. Now unfortunately, I don't have anything in particular that fits exactly what I need, but I do have some offcuts which I think I can fashion into a working tool post. I have an offcut from an old project and a piece of steel which I milled into a few years ago, and I've been struggling to find a good use for these pieces. So I'll use them here, see how it works, and if needs be, I can always replace them for a solid piece of steel if I need to. So the first thing I'll do is just get them both cleaned up. Like everything else, it's going to get keyed so it stays parallel with the cross slide. And that is a pretty good fit. I now need to machine in the slot for the tool holder, and the bottom of the slot needs to be on the center line of the spindle. So I'll simply scribe a line and use that as a visual reference. And that looks to be pretty much on center line. So the final thing left to do is get those two pieces welded together. Alright, and there you have it. Took a bit more time to do than I thought it would, but in the end, it is still a pretty straightforward project to do. I'll be honest, it does look a bit weird, but if it saves me from breaking tools, I'll be all for it. Now, as I mentioned before, my carbide tool holder is a bit buggered, and I don't have any holders for holding these high-speed steel parting blades. However, I do have some brazed carbide tooling. Not really the biggest fan of brazed carbide, but for a bit of testing, it should do the job. Alright, and that worked surprisingly well. The tip of that carbide is set a little bit too high, so it didn't cut all the way through, but apart from that, it did a really good job. And 5 seconds with the hacksaw is enough to finish it off. And I gotta say, that is a pretty clean cut. All in all, I'm really happy with it. And at this point, I'd normally say in a video, well, that's about it for now. But in truth, it wasn't, because I still want to use my high-speed steel parting blade, so let's figure that out. Now, making a tool holder like this should not be difficult because it's fairly basic and I have the steel for it and most of the cutters. And when I say most of the cutters, I mean most because the one that's really holding me back is the T-slot cutter, which I need to make the inside profile. This is the T-slot cutter which I used earlier in the video, and whilst it's a very good T-slot cutter, it's a little bit too big for this job. Now, I had a look online to find a smaller T-slot cutter, and I found one that was the correct size, and they were asking about $26 for it. And I don't know about you, but $26? Tell him he's dreaming. So instead what I did was I went out and I bought a piece of silver steel, which I paid about $40 for. And using it, I'm going to make my own T-slot cutter. So the first thing I'll do is I'll get the collet chuck swapped in, and then I'll turn down the basic profile. Now over at the milling machine, I'll start to machine in the flutes. And as you can probably see, for this, I'm going to be using a simple dovetail cutter. It's not going to give me the perfect cutting geometry, but it will work. And for a cutting tool that I'm probably going to use only once, I just need it to work. With the flutes now cut in, I'll start to machine in the clearance behind the cutting edge. Alright, that cutter isn't going to be winning any awards, but I'm pretty confident that that cutter should work. The final thing left to do is get this thing hardened, and then I'll go get it tempered. With the tool now tempering in the oven, let's get started on the tool holder itself. Like everything else, it's made from scrap steel, so we need to quickly clean it up. And that fits really well in the tool post. With the slot now machined, let's now bring in the T-slot cutter, freshly baked out of the oven. Now because I made the cutter from silver steel, I do need to run it pretty slowly. If I run it too fast and it heats up, it will lose its temper and it will lose its hardness. But even so, for such a basic cutter, it is doing a really good job. The final thing left to do is use the slitting saw to cut a slot, and we should be all good to go. Alright, and that's turned out looking really good. So let's go ahead and see how it works. And like the brazed carbide, that did a really good job at cutting. Now once again, I think I ground the tip a little bit high, so it isn't cutting all the way to the center, but apart from that, it did a really good job. The important thing is though, that I was able to do all of that, and not at one point was I afraid that I was going to snap that cutter. And that is the important thing. It certainly doesn't feel as rigid as it did before, so I'm not pushing it as hard or as fast as I normally would, but if that means that I can part stuff and not break any inserts or break any parting blades, that is definitely worth the trade-off. I don't know, what do you guys think? I'll certainly be running this in the background just to see how well it works. I'll definitely pick up another carbide insert holder and see how that works, and I'll tell you in a few weeks' time if I'll keep this or revert back to, well, how it used to be. And with that, thank you very much for watching, I hope you enjoyed this video, and I'll see you next week.